Let me begin, though, with something of the history of the institution and its collections. I mean, many, excuse me if everybody knows this very well, but I think it might be useful for some. The Ashmolean opened to the public in 1683 and is therefore Britain's oldest museum. Oxford and Basel dispute the claim to be the oldest public museum in the world. The Kunstmuseum in Basel claims that the Ammerbach collection was open to the public in the 1660s. I don't believe it for a minute. I think it was only open to the elite of Basel. But the thing about the Ashmolean, the most important feature of the Ashmolean, is it was genuinely open to the public from the first day it opened. And we have still the early visitors' books of the Ashmolean. We know that many ordinary visitors came, many signed the book with a cross, and were therefore illiterate. And there is, wonderfully in these books, if you look through them, there's one day in the week which is particularly popular, and that, of course, was market day in Oxford. And you came with your goose, you sold your goose at the market, and you went to the museum, which was just right. And we have a very interesting account of this, writing in his diary in 1710, rather priggish young German aristocrat Zacharias Conrad von Uffenbach, who clearly was used to visiting Central European collections, aristocratic collections in Central Europe, by the invitation of the owner. He was appalled at the crowds of country folk to be found in the museum on a market day. And he comments, and I quote, "Even the women are allowed up here for sixpence. They run here and there, grabbing at everything in the English manner, and taking no rebuff from the custos, from the invigilators." Quite what he meant by the English manner is not entirely clear to me, but anyway, that's what he wrote. And I think there is a very interesting distinction there between the aristocratic visitor to a private collection, invited by the owner and shown the collection, and a public museum for the first time. Let me just remind you that the museum today houses one of the most important collections of art and archaeology to be found anywhere, beginning in 8000 BC with Neolithic basalts up to the present day, covering all the world's great civilizations. I'm afraid only South America and Australasia are underrepresented. And just to remind you, among the great treasures of the Ashmolean are the world's largest, most important single group of drawings by Raphael, and there, of course, are two of them, very familiar to you. Cartoon for the Transfiguration, and on the right, the early self-portrait. The most substantial collection of pre-dynastic Egyptian material outside Cairo, and you saw much of this in the exhibition recently at the Metropolitan. The only significant collection of Minoan material outside Crete itself, one of the great collections of Anglo-Saxon material, of course, and less expectedly, I think, for this audience, one of the foremost collections of modern Chinese painting in the West, which has come about. I mean, it's a very interesting and unexpected collection, I think, in the Ashmolean, but it came about in a very interesting way. A brilliant curator of our Chinese collections who came in the late 1950s, Mary Tregear, started buying, feeling that historic Chinese material, paintings particularly, had been faked a great deal. It was very difficult to tell what was truly historic. She bought contemporary material, and she was buying from the late 50s onwards, and so we do have this extraordinary collection, as well as the collection of somebody who some of you will know, Michael Sullivan, which is also the great scholar of Chinese painting, which is lodged. We have the good fortune to have it in the Ashmolean. So, just to remind you of some of the treasures of the museum, the redevelopment that we've recently undertaken has been the most significant event in the museum's long history, since it moved from its first home, there on the top left, in Broad Street. That's where it's in that building, which now houses the Museum of the History of Science in Oxford, which first housed the Ashmolean. That's where it opened in 1683, opened by the Duke of York, who wants to become, briefly, James II. Through its move to the University Galleries on Beaumont Street, and there it is, constructed to the design of the architect Charles Cockerell. Very interesting figure, Cockerell, both archaeologist as well as architect. And of course he had excavated the Temple of Apollo at Bassae, and of course he knew it's in a very thoroughgoing Neo-Greek style, and he clearly knew what a Greek temple was because he dug one up. And it is indeed very, very thoroughgoing in its detail. Although, let me just also remind you of the remarkable history of this museum. Although the Ashmolean is named, of course, for Elias Ashmole, who presented the founding collections to the university, these collections were formed by two gardeners and plantsmen, John Tredescant the elder and John, his son, John the younger. And in both, of course, you see John the elder in his cartouche decorated by fruit and vegetables, appropriately, on the left. And then you see John the younger resting on his spade. It's important, I think, to make the point. This was not an aristocratic collection in its origins, collection of two botanists and plantsmen. And they assembled a remarkable collection of botanical specimens, zoological and geological material, as well as exotic artifacts from around the world. Their employer, they worked for the Duke of Buckingham, and following the assassination of Buckingham in 1628, they showed their collection in their house in Lambeth, in South London, the White House on the left, the Ark, which was known as the Ark, not, I think, because everything was 2 by 2, but because everything was there. And it attracted a lot of attention, and a visit to the Ark. Many 17th century commentators say that a visit to the Ark was like going round the world in a day. And this is a very important. I'll return to this theme. This was the idea that visiting the Ark was like going round the world. And of course, one of those who was absolutely fascinated by the Tredescant Museum was Elias Ashmole, a lawyer, antiquarian, and he was so fascinated by this collection that he bought the red house, the big red house next door, to keep an eye on it, I think. He was a rather different figure. As you can see, he doesn't rest on a spade in any way at all. He rests on a volume of his own devising. He wrote a history of the Garter, and that's what he's resting his hand on. And he wears a gold chain given to him by the King of Denmark, who was a member of the Order of the Garter. So altogether a different character. And his value to the Tredescants particularly was that he helped them catalogue the collections. The first catalogue, the Tredescant Museum, was published in Latin, of course, but the second edition, published in the mid-1650s in English, it's the first, according to the OED, it is the first use of the Latin word museum in English. Of course, the Latin word with a Greek root, but is in that catalogue. So here we are at the very beginning of the whole notion of a museum in the English-speaking world. On the death of John the Younger in 1659, the collection passed to Ashmole. I mean, not without a certain amount of skullduggery, I think, but he certainly had his eye on the collection for a very long time. And I'm afraid poor Mrs. Tredescant lost out, rather unfortunately, anyway, he got the collection, and something very interesting happens to the collection at that moment. He is a founding member of the Royal Society, and he sees the potential of the collections in the teaching of the natural sciences. I mean, that's why he gives the collection to the university. He presents it to his university, Oxford, in 1677, on the understanding that the university would build a building to house it, which of course it did. The building there, which still stands, the building on Broad Street, which, as I said, houses the Museum of the History of Science. And as it opened in 1683, the collections were shown on the top floor. On the ground floor were teaching rooms for the teaching of the natural sciences in the university, and there was a chemistry laboratory in the basement. I mean, some said alchemical laboratory in the basement. And my first predecessor, the first keeper of the Ashmolean, Robert Plott, was actually the first professor of chemistry in the university. I think it's extremely interesting that this collection was seen in the context of the teaching of natural sciences in the university and not of what we think of today as the humanities. And just as an aside, Robert Plott was very poorly paid by the University of Oxford, and you won't be surprised to know that this tradition has continued happily to the present day. And in order to supplement his meagre earnings from the university, he created in that basement laboratory Dr. Plott's Elixir of Life. And you could buy a small phial of Dr. Plott's Elixir of Life at the front door of the Ashmolean in the 1690s. However, Dr. Plott did not live to be an old man, and so we must assume that his Elixir of Life was ineffective. As I say, the opening date was May the 21st, 1683, and of course, fascinatingly, as there were no museums, so there were no public museums, there were no rules to establish behaviour within museums. So what Ashmole did, as you can see on the right, and that's his own hand, is to write the statutes, order and rules for the Ashmolean Museum in the University of Oxford. And it establishes a board of governance, a sort of trustee body, which is called the Visitors of the Ashmolean, and we still have that body. And it starts absolutely from basics, because what it says is the first thing that the visitors must do is to visit the museum and to make sure everything is still there. I mean, this is, and it is a very interesting idea, I think, that here you are at the very beginning of the notion of museums, what museums, and you have to make the rules about how they should, and it also contains how people should behave, how they should be let in, that they should sign, they should sign the book at the door, and so on and so on. I mean, so all the basic rules of how a museum functions, how a public museum functions, are to be found here, written in Ashmole's own hand. And this, I think, a slightly fanciful idea of how the collections were originally displayed on the first floor. Well, actually, this is part of the ground floor of the old Ashmolean. During the 18th century, and I'm rushing, as you can judge. I want to come on to what we've been doing more recently, but just to remind you, during the 18th century, the collections of specimens in the museum lost a great deal of their academic relevance. They play a diminishing role in the scientific work carried out in the museum building and elsewhere in the university. I mean, I just draw your attention to a couple of to a very important acquisition, the Alfred Jewel, perhaps the most famous, most striking Anglo-Saxon object, donated to the museum in 1718. Also, we acquired a very important collection of ethnographic material collected on Captain Cook's Pacific voyage of 1772 to 5. And I see I've also included on this slide Powhatan's mantle. Of course, the Ashmolean has the most important collection of Native American material in any any museum in Britain. Powhatan, of course, a hugely important figure in his own time, but has come down to us, of course, as the father of Pocahontas. And this is described in the Tredescant Museum catalogue as the mantle of the King of Virginia, which presumably was suggested by what appears to be a neck hole, as you can see at the top. What, of course, it really is presumably a ritual hanging. We recently had a visit from the chief of the Powhatan Indians, who came to the museum to view the mantle, and she wished to perform a ceremony in front of it which involved the burning of grasses, which with modern health and safety requirements in a museum was quite a difficult thing to do. She very kindly agreed to do it on the forecourt of the museum in the event. And of course at that moment you wait for the "can we have it back please" question. But no, we are very pleased by the way you display this object. We are very happy that 1 million people a year in Oxford see this object. And so I too was happy by that with that result. This is a question, of course, we can discuss later. Significant changes take place in the 19th century, particularly under the period of office of Arthur Evans, who was keeper of the old Ashmolean collection. Here he is at Knossos, and it was under his very energetic leadership that the archaeological collections in the museum expanded at an impressive rate. And he arranged, interestingly, for the ethnographic collections to go to the newly founded Pitt Rivers Museum elsewhere in the university in exchange for other materials held inappropriately in other university departments. So it was he who was responsible for a sort of general post that took place in the 1890s. But clearly what the original building, the original Ashmolean building in Broad Street, couldn't cope with this extraordinary influx. This was not only, it was his own material from his own excavations in the Balkans and subsequently at Crete, of course, his father's great collection of prehistoric material, Flinders Petrie's excavations in Egypt. All this material was coming in the 1890s, early 1900s, and it required more space. And so what happened was that Evans persuaded the university to erect new premises on the back, as it were, of the existing building. Here you are. Yes, there we are. So here, of course, is the existing 1845 building of the university, which was opened as the University Galleries to show the university's collections essentially of paintings and classical sculpture. And then the great archaeological collections, the original founding collections, were moved over from Broad Street into this building, and Evans built on the back here a series of what were more or less pitched roof sheds with pitched roofs, very simple structures attached onto the back of Cockerell's very elegant building. And what happens is that the material from the old museum is gradually moved over to these new buildings, and that process was completed by about 1894. And it was 1908 that the two collections are formally merged to form the museum, the Ashmolean Museum of Art and Archaeology. So essentially the archaeological collections from Broad Street were shown with the classical sculpture, the paintings and the drawings which were in the university galleries. And then subsequently during the 20th century other collections from elsewhere in the university also come to Beaumont Street. So coins and medals. This is the old display of coins and medals. So in 1921, the university's remarkable collection of coins and medals were moved from the Bodleian Library to the Ashmolean, and as late as 1961, and this is the old previous display on the top right, 1961 saw the formal removal to the Ashmolean of the collections of the old Indian Institute, which had very strong Islamic, Indian, Chinese and Japanese collections, and they were moved over to the Ashmolean. Of course, university teaching and research have always been central to the work of the Ashmolean, and I will return to that too. But it was as late as 1981 that a public education service was set up to serve the general public and school parties. A unitary department of conservation was created in 1999, which meant that actually for the first time in the museum's history, preventative and interventive conservation needs of the collections could be addressed in a strategic way. It was a very important moment that, but here were the conditions under which we were working before we undertook the big project. This is one of the conservation studios, which was very crowded and unsatisfactory, as you can see, and then the education service, which had no place to teach, except, as you can see in this, in the galleries themselves, which of course is the purpose of such teaching, but one wants an introductory, one wants seminar rooms and so on to begin to introduce the collections to, particularly to school parties, as you can see there. I came to the Ashmolean, as Ivan's kindly mentioned, as director in 1998, having previously been at the National Gallery in London, which I joined as a very small child, as he also kindly said. And of course I arrived knowing the museum very well, both as a visitor, having been an undergraduate and graduate at Oxford. So I knew the museum to hold spectacular collections, but in overcrowded displays, in what, particularly in the case of the 1894 editions, were intended to be temporary. It's quite clear from the plans of the 1894 editions that they were intended originally to be temporary, and there they were, still in place 100 years later. There was no environmental control except for portable humidifiers, so very significant parts of the collection we were unable to show. Notably, worth bringing to your attention, I think, are absolutely unequalled collections of Islamic textiles, which we simply were unable to show at all. There was no education centre, so these are children eating their sandwiches on the forecourt, and so the school groups had nowhere other than public areas to assemble. And of course, the museum was split over two sites. This was a rather modest entrance to the Cast Gallery, behind the principal building, in a 1960s building tucked behind the main Ashmolean building. In short, we were failing to do justice either to the collections, which are of course of absolutely international importance, or indeed to our visitors from around the world. Arriving at the museum, I commissioned a master plan which made it clear that these problems particularly associated with the 1894 additions to the original building. We originally tried to make these areas work better, improve the lighting, display, labelling and so on, but gradually it became clear that a radical solution was required, and as luck would have it, in the winter of 1999-2000, the roof of one of these part of this 1894 edition was blown off in a gale, which made it clear that not only were they not doing their job very well, but they were also going to be a real maintenance headache going forward. So it was from early in 2000 that we planned essentially the demolition of the 1894 edition, which constituted over 60% of the museum, so it was a radical thing to do, and the redevelopment of that part of the site. And so the opportunity which the development presented to us was to create a building which would be a fitting home for the collections and an important and distinctive addition to the architectural landscape of Oxford. I always wanted from the beginning to have a contemporary building, a building of the 21st century, rather than a pastiche of a 19th century building. 19th century pastiche is favoured in some areas of Oxford, but not by me. So the museum held a competition for architects to design the new building, which was won by Rick Mather's practice in London. Rick is particularly known for his sensitive treatment of historic buildings, I think, creating new spaces in a classic modern idiom which respect the existing buildings. This is the work that he did at the Dulwich Picture Gallery, which many of you will know. He's worked at the National Maritime Museum, the Wallace Collection, London. He's done the new building. I hope some of you have seen it. I think it's a very beautiful building, the new Virginia Museum of Fine Arts building at Richmond. And he's also done a couple of buildings at Keble College in Oxford. So the new building sits behind. Here you are. Here is of course, the Cockerell building, 1845 building, which, as you can see, is only one gallery deep. And then this is the area where the 1890 additions were. And this shows you when we had just demolished those buildings and we were going down a floor into the site. It was a very complex site to deal with because, of course, there are university buildings all around it. I mean, it's a very constricted site, not unlike the Fitzwilliam in Cambridge, which of course has green. Fitzwilliam in Cambridge, that's a small museum in a distant spot in East Anglia, which it has, of course, green space all around it. But we were working with this. This is the Sackler Library on the left, the University's Library of Art and Archaeology, the Oriental Institute, the Classics building behind, and then the Taylorium. So it's a very constricted site on which to work. I'll just take you quickly, yes, and those very buildings. So now you come in through the portico, through the front, through Cockerell's great portico, through the front door, which is now open to its full height for the first time in 80 years. You pass through the narrow 1845 building, as you can see on the right, and you're drawn to the heart of Mather's new addition by the fall of light from the huge skylight through 6 floors, connected by a dramatic staircase, which steps back as it rises through the building. And key to understanding the new building is its relationship to Cockerell's University Galleries. I mean, we worked very hard. If you're going to, of course, put a contemporary building like this in a, as it were, a modern idiom, if you're going to attach it to the back of an 1845 building with quite rich sculptural decoration, of course, the key to it is managing the transition. And it was really that got Rick the job. I mean, that got Rick Mather the job. His ability to work with a historic building in a very sympathetic way. And what he essentially does, I'm just trying to think how, that's the staircase. But I think perhaps I can make my point best from these. Essentially, what happens now is you move from the old building to the new building on this level here, on the ground level, and on the first floor level. You go directly through. In the old arrangement, there were changes of level, which were very unsatisfactory, and particularly, of course, for any kind of disabled access to the museum. So you go straight through from on the ground on the first floor, from old to new. That, of course, creates a basic module of space, as it were. It creates a basic size of gallery, 6 meters high. And you can see here 3 6-meter galleries stacked, one on top of the other. And essentially, the way the rhythm of the architecture works is you break off 3-meter high galleries from the 6-meter high galleries, so you have a rhythm of 6, 3, 6 all the way through the building. It is a grid, but it's a grid that really makes the space work. Because of the constriction of the site, it really sweats the space, I think, very, very effectively. And then you move from, sort of, as it were, at mezzanine level on these bridges, which run from east to west at the front and from north to south at the back of the building. And then this staircase takes you through the building, all the way through the 6 floors. Essentially, again, an important constriction on the site was that we could only go down 1 floor because of the water table in that part of Oxford, and we could only go up to the top, to the 6th floor, because it was a condition of listed building consent. It was a condition of actually demolishing the 1890 edition, that you shouldn't see the modern building as you approach, as you come up, quite properly. I mean, it's entirely happy with that arrangement. As you come up to the Cockerell building, as you come up to the great neoclassical portico, you don't see the new museum at all. And all this space sits behind the existing, the earlier building. And these are other views of the central area of the museum. And the bridges, have an important. They link galleries, but also, as I'll come to in a moment, they are quite literally bridges between cultures. In total, the building provides us with 39 new galleries. We now have about 70 galleries in the building, 4 for temporary exhibitions, 35 for the permanent collection. We have an education centre, a loading bay. Can you imagine a museum on this scale that didn't have a loading bay? Everything had to be trundled down the stairs and go out the front door to a vehicle which is parked on a double yellow line in Beaumont Street. Study and teaching rooms, and I'll return to that. It's important, of course, to have major storage facilities, offices, conservation studios, and a rooftop restaurant, of course, commanding striking views over Oxford from a terrace on the top, and of course a glorious director's office, but that is, of course, is very important. And we control, for the first time, of course, we are able to control the environment all the way through the building. Now, most importantly, I think, for what I'm going to say this evening, of course, when you do something on this scale, you demolish 65% of the museum, you double display space on that footprint. It provides the opportunity to rethink the way the collections, these encyclopedic collections, are displayed. And I want to, these are the other facilities we provided. Here's we now have proper education space, of course, to introduce younger visitors. We also have wonderful conservation studios at the top of the building, as you can see, with marvellous north light. My conservation colleagues are like pigs in clover, they tell me. But let me just return to this. So the key question is really this question of the display of the collections in these new spaces. And that's really what I would like to be at the heart of, perhaps, of our discussion this evening, simply how you do that, and the way that we have done it. The museum, like all great long-established museums, is divided into departments. It functions in departments, so these are the departments, as you can see: Western Art, Eastern Art, Antiquities, which are the archaeological collections, of course, the coin room, and a cast gallery. Interestingly, the Ashmolean, unlike, may I say, the Metropolitan, kept its cast gallery, and very important it is too. I mean, we have some 17th century casts. I mean, we have, of course, very important 19th century casts too. And there, of course, we have some very, very recent casts. This is recent from the recent excavation at Aphrodisias, which is a joint excavation between New York University and Oxford, of course. And this is part. This is a reconstruction figure of a fisherman from Aphrodisias. So in the old arrangement, these collections were displayed by department. So geographical areas, as it were, of the museum occupied by individual departments, and very little thought given to how the ways in which those collections are related. Coins, for example, could only be seen in the coin room, and that could be quite a dispiriting experience. And I've long felt, I mean, as a visitor, this was long before I went to the Ashmolean, it applies, of course, not just to the Ashmolean, but I've long felt that such an arrangement, perhaps we can talk about this later, must inevitably emphasize cultural difference rather than cultural contact and exchange. If this is Eastern art, this is Western art, here are the archaeological collections, surely it must essentially emphasize cultural difference, surely. So what we did was to devise a new display strategy, and this was at the end of lots of seminars, discussions with our colleagues in the university, and of course, being part of a great university, we were able to bring in colleagues from archaeology, from classical studies, from history, from Oriental studies, a whole series of seminars in which we thought about how to display these collections. And I felt I had worked for a very long time in the National Gallery, and of course hanging pictures is a doddle, as we all know. That's very, very easy to do. But dealing with this kind of material is much harder, I think, and presents much more interesting challenges, but much more challenging, as it were, challenges too. And so we talked a lot, and as I'm sure this audience is only too well aware, to put some academics in a room and ask them to discuss a problem such as this, one could be there several years later and no farther forward. But we did develop our strategy. We called it Crossing Cultures, Crossing Time, because it needed to be, as it were, put across in this way. And let me describe it, I hope, succinctly with an example. We have a major group of sculpture from Gandhara, of course, modern Pakistan and Afghanistan. This is 1st and 2nd century AD, showing, as you see on the left hand here, showing the Buddha wearing Roman provincial dress. I mean, the Buddha essentially wearing a toga. And so a figure such as this does represent the point at which the classical world meets the world of the Indian subcontinent. Here you have a new Eastern iconography produced by the new religion of Buddhism, expressed within the language of classical art at the very edge of Alexander's empire. So in displaying material such as this, surely one has to take account of Gandharan sculpture's relationship to later Buddhist sculpture in India and China, but also to the classical tradition, to its relationship to the classical tradition. And you can't do this within the traditional departmental display. I mean, in the traditional departmental display, such sculpture is displayed with the sculpture of India, China, and Japan, which tells, as it were, half of the story, but entirely misses the relationship to the classical world, which is so important to understand sculpture of this kind. So what did we do? We created a route through the ground floor. With the ground floor, as you come into it now, is devoted to, let me see if that, yeah, is devoted to the ancient world. I mean, by the ancient world we mean 8000 BC to the fall of Rome, so we're dealing with a large historical period. So what happens now, as it were, you come in through the portico, here we are, you come in to an introductory gallery here, which is, it introduces you to the chronology and the geography of the ancient world. It introduces you already to material from 4 of the 5 departments of the museum in a great central case, and then you turn left. You turn left because people in public buildings in Britain turn left. We've done this research, and it's true. It may have something to do with the side of the road we drive. I don't know why it is, but you turn left. So you go through. You come in through the Aegean Bronze Age, the ancient Near East, ancient Cyprus. This area is devoted to these are the Egyptian galleries, ancient Cyprus, Greece. Ancient Cyprus, European prehistory, Greece, Rome, Gandhara, India, China, and Japan. So you essentially go around the world. You go around the world at a certain historical moment, and by placing the Gandharan sculpture between the classical sculpture between Rome and India, we hope that you make that connection, which will explain the language of Gandharan sculpture. Now, we hope that our visitors can follow this chronology. I like it particularly because it has a wonderful echo of that 17th century reaction to going around the Ark in Lambeth, that you are actually going around the world in a day. I mean, I think that is a very attractive historical resonance of the way of laying out these collections. And of course, this is not programmatic. I mean, it doesn't. This is not the only way. Of course, you can, as it were, visit the Ashmolean. I mean, if your prime interest is in Meiji Japan, you can go straight to the galleries of Meiji Japan. But it is remarkable when you do audience surveys how many first-time visitors you have to museums. It always surprises me. And for the first-time visitor who doesn't have a specialist knowledge, to have a narrative through the collections of this kind, in my view, is extremely helpful. So you go through, around that gallery. So you come to, as I say, through Gandhara to Han China, to prehistoric Japan. And for example, in all these galleries, there are coins. Coins are a prominent part of the display, providing a historical context for many of the other exhibits. And essentially that principle is then applies to the other principal galleries all the way through the building. So the ancient world we've talked about. The next floor, as you can see, is called Asian Crossroads. We talk about particularly about cultural influence along trade routes in Asia. Then West meets East is the theme of the gallery again, is essentially the relationship between Europe and the Far East from the 16th to the 19th centuries. And then there's an exhibition, a temporary exhibition floor above that. I can talk about this in greater detail. The lower ground floor, so if instead of going around on the ground floor you go down one floor, is more thematic in character. We have a gallery which introduces you to the sculpture collections of the museum, and also, extremely importantly, here for the first time, the great Islamic textile collections are shown in a gallery. Now, of course, it's important to have the textile gallery on the lower ground floor because one has to control both light and humidity with in a very precise way. But to be able to put out these collections for the first time is a very important part of what we've just been doing. Here are some other examples. These are this is the Mughal India gallery on the first floor. One of the Chinese galleries on the second floor, and I can talk about these in more detail later. And then there's a large temporary exhibition gallery. We had a big Claude exhibition which we did with the Stadel in Frankfurt last year, and then there's the, as it were, the 20th and 21st century collections also on that floor. We opened, as I mentioned, we had our press views in October 2009, a very large press conference. We had more than 100 journalists visiting, and this here I'm just showing off really. These are the glowing tributes to the museum. But I mean, just to give some sense of the response to that. And again, as you can see, I particularly like this headline, as you can imagine, around the world, ticket for a clear and concise history. I mean, this sense of going around the world became, I hope, clear to the journalists and to our visitors. Jonathan Glancy, writing for The Guardian, summed it up saying the new building brought fresh life to the Ashmolean and to Oxford, a fine new public place, a museum to return to time and time again. Extremely important to us. In the first year following the reopening of the museum, we had 1.2 million visitors. I know that one doesn't judge the success of museums just on visitor numbers, and that's extremely important. Of course, the experience is the key thing we're talking about. But for a university museum to have 1.2 million visitors in a small town like Oxford. Oxford has a population of 165,000 people. So either every inhabitant of Oxford came 7 times, or whatever it may be, to the Ashmolean, or we brought in a lot of other visitors. And I do think this is important, if I may say, if we're talking in this context. I mean, I don't want to cast aspersions on Ivan's previous place of employment, but the Fog doesn't exceed 100,000 visitors a year. So I mean, one's talking about this is quite interesting. The idea of a university museum that can communicate to a broad public and put across, often, particularly put across new ideas developed within the university to a very broad public. This is a very important role of any university museum, and something that we're very, very conscious of doing at the Ashmolean. We are now the most visited museum outside London in England. I mean, Glasgow has high numbers. This was the rather bemused lady who was our millionth visitor. She came through the front door of the Ashmolean with her daughter and was very surprised to be accosted by the director in a great state of excitement, who then presented her with I think this was a voucher to go and have lunch in the Ashmolean restaurant or something like that. Anyway, she recovered from her shock and the fact that she was going to have her picture taken by the local paper, and there she is. So we celebrated our millionth visitor. We have also a major, because of the new third floor galleries for temporary exhibitions, we put on a run of major exhibitions. We now are able to take major international loan exhibitions. These are some of the exhibitions we've done up until now. Yes, I mean, you can read as well as I can there. You can see what we're doing. We also have smaller temporary displays. This very wonderful exhibition we did on the Iranian press, is the private press that Lucien Pizarro created, and which ran up until the outbreak of the First World War. In London we have a great Pizarro archive in the Ashmolean, and this is part of it. We also have a major collection of more or less contemporary Chinese prints, and then just this year, we celebrated Edward Lear's birthday, and we also put, I think, a very original exhibition of textiles from Meiji Japan. This is the first time this material had ever been exhibited outside Japan. Wonderful textiles, which of course were made for Western audiences, and in which no aesthetic home. This is the kind of textile that Mrs. Oscar Wilde hung on her walls in Tite Street. We are this year, we're just about to open a big Shu Bing exhibition. This is significant for us because this is the first time we're going to devote the 600 square meters of our temporary exhibition spaces to a living artist, and that we chose a Chinese artist for this is extremely significant because it relates, of course, to the great collections we have of contemporary Chinese material. We also will put out, we have, as you will all know, one of the great master drawing collections of the world, and we will put out the high points of that later this year. We will celebrate our 330th anniversary. It's rather I mean, why we choose 330, I must say, but you must celebrate every anniversary, I think. But we celebrate it by putting out that exhibition. I also just want to draw attention to one or two of the other things we've been doing. Clearly, like all museums, as well as doing exhibitions, as well as particularly in the Ashmolean, doing teaching and research, we of course, like all museums, are embarking on major initiatives to put the collections online. The first stage of this, and can I commend this website to you, was the launch of the Yusuf Jamil Center for Islamic and Asian Art. This is Eastern Art Online, as you can see. So this is a new website which you reach through our the museum's own site, which really is very well designed. We re-photographed all the thousands of objects in, first of all, the Islamic collections, then the rest of the Asian collections, a major scholarly resource and a major resource for the public. We also launched a Ruskin website. As you may know, Ruskin formed a very important teaching collection, which he then, after when he was held the Slade Chair at Oxford, he then presented to the Ashmolean. It then became incorporated with the run of the collections, and his very remarkable way of teaching, the way he organised these collections in order to teach, was lost. So what we've done here is to recreate his teaching methods using his own collection. So it's a fascinating website. I do recommend it to you. The physical expansion of the development of the museum has continued. Phase 2 is the redisplay of the Egyptian collections, the renovation, expansion of the Egyptian collections, which are situated in the west wing of the building. I mean, we do have the most important Egyptian collections in England after the BM, but for, of course, the pre-dynastic period, the very beginnings of Egyptian civilization, these are the finest outside Cairo. So we have the great Min figures. This is how we used to show them. And of course, this emphasizes the huge conservation effort that was involved in redisplaying the collections. But here, for the first time, these extraordinary Min figures, these come from Coptos, excavated by Flinders Petrie. This 3,500 BC. I mean, one of the most extraordinary things about coming to the Ashmolean was that the display of the collections, on the whole, big things were in small galleries and small things were in big galleries. It was counterintuitive in every possible respect. But here, for the first time, we've given these great, extraordinary, brutal, powerful, raw images of fertility. We've given them the space they need to have the effect. I mean, this extraordinarily powerful effect. We have the great mace heads. And here we have the only pharaonic monument in its entirety in any museum in Britain is in this gallery. The great shrine of Taharqa from Upper Nubia, now the Sudan, of course. It's the only freestanding building, and again we've redisplayed it in this gallery, not normally with blue light, but as seems to be in this slide, but with natural light from above the gallery. And then there's a gallery devoted, of course, we have great mummy collections, and of course we have very important collections, Tel El Amarna, the capital of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, And we bring together, again, of course, these collections were divided and as part of the partage arrangement when they were excavated by Flinders Petrie, divided between a number of museums, and we brought together, the British Museum has been very generous in lending material to us, so we brought together, for example, the two great figures of Akhenaten and Nefertiti for the first time since they were excavated. And this finally is more of the new Egyptian galleries, and then the final gallery. I can't help just mentioning that we had a campaign last year to acquire a major painting by Manet, which I was really, we are of course a museum that continues to make significant acquisitions. This is presently in the Manet portrait exhibition, which is on at the Royal Academy at the present time. We launched, as you can see, an appeal to buy the picture. It was a very interesting case, this. The picture had been bought at Manet's studio sale of 1884 by John Singer Sargent, and of course his family came to live, as you know, in England, and it's remained in the private collection of the family ever since. We bought it from a direct descendant of Sargent. It was an extraordinary case and quite an interesting one. Perhaps the details interest me more than they do you, but the picture had been sold to a foreign buyer outside the UK for £28 million. It was then put under a temporary export bar, and the legislation in the UK is that an institution in the UK could make an attempt within a certain period of time to raise the same money. But as luck would have it, this picture attracted a very high tax. It actually had a tax bill of 80%. I mean, extraordinarily, because of the circumstances of the family. So I only had to raise £8 million to acquire it within about 3 months, and we did it. And it really is a major addition to the Ashmolean, of which I'm very proud and pleased. We're currently carrying out the renovation of the Randolph Sculpture Gallery, where the Arundel marbles, the first great collection of classical sculpture ever made in Britain, are displayed. We'll fix the lighting, we'll restore the floor, we'll return the decoration to the extraordinary, wonderful scheme of imitation porphyry and green, which was created by Cockerell in 1845. And I'm not quite finished yet, because there is a phase 3, and you'll see from this aerial shot that the area that's indicated in red there is a first floor courtyard, which I'm hoping to fill in very shortly and create another 800 square metres of space. We'll be able to show particularly our Dutch and Flemish pictures, our drawings, and we will have a substantial gallery devoted to the display of contemporary art for the first time. It's clearly one of the things that we don't do well at all, and we must do very much better. So I hope that, and this is simply how we fill in that new gallery. As you can see, we can create 3 galleries of about 300 square metres each on top of each other in that area of the museum. I don't quite know what the man with braces is doing there, but he recurs from time to time. But this is a top floor, part of the top floor gallery, which has, I think we're not going to have, this is of course what architects do to try and sell you schemes. They show these wonderful views of the city. Of course, what we actually want are walls, not not windows. But there will be some views from the top. So I hope that I've said enough to intrigue you. I hope I've said enough to encourage you to pay a visit. And importantly, if I may just conclude, admission to the Ashmolean is free. Thank you very much.